I am Jim Florwick. I'm a technical marketing engineer. Today, I want to talk about Wi-Fi 6E design recommendations, and we did a whole lot of work around that, and it's difficult right now because there's not a lot of good tools, as you all know. Um, I'm going to talk about AI enhanced RRM again. I love it. We just ran it at Cisco Live 2022, so I was going to kind of update you on quickly what it said. We're going to touch on CleanAir Pro again. We did talk about CleanAir Pro pretty extensively back during Cisco Live, but I'm just going to touch on that again here. And then we're going to dive into zero weight DFS and how we're able to do that and what's coming on that, because I think that's an awesome innovation. And I think everybody's had their fill with DFS or their challenges with it at one time or another. All right, so a quick recap. You just saw all these APs, we're making them, but what do you do with them? All right. And I've heard a lot of chatter, and there's been a lot of talk out there. A lot of you have been talking about it. 6 gigahertz. Well, it's higher frequency, so the path loss is going to be higher. Yep. The cell size is going to be smaller. Yes. Absorption, reflectance. You don't control a lot of that now, but yes, it's going to be different. And you know what? It was different when we went into 5 gigahertz too. In fact, it's actually not as different between 5 and 6 gigahertz as it was between 2.4 and 5 gigahertz. So all these things are true if you assume the same power levels, but that would probably be a mistake. And as we were thinking it through, Wi-Fi 6E is not Wi-Fi 6, and that's actually a good thing. If you take a look at the regulatories around the world, everybody's been putting out these power levels, and it could be actually pretty confusing. If you just look at this chart on the front, it looks like a lot of people did different things. A lot of people did same things. There's two models out there, really. There's ETSI and then there's FCC, and they're modeled a little bit differently. But what we're going to focus in on right now is really just two good examples of the deltas there. And I threw the UK in here because I thought it was fun that they got one more dB everywhere. But if you break down the PSD values, those power spectral density values, for us in the US, the FCC side, we get 5 dB per megahertz. And the client gets -1. So that's a 6 dB delta from the peak EIRP. We get a maximum 30 and 24. If you take a look at ETSI, they're getting 10 and 10. So the client doesn't pay a penalty. They get 10. However, they do get clipped at 23 dBm for both the client and the AP. So how's that break down? Well, in the FCC, we got 1200 megahertz. We're able to make 80 megahertz channels. We're able to use 80 megahertz channels. And we expect with that much spectrum, we're going to be using 80 megahertz channels. So that puts me at 24 dBm for a max EIRP. If you take a look at ETSI, they've got the PSD values, but they pretty much max out on 20 megahertz. So you can't go any higher than 23 dBm, which is good because it lets them make their max power in 40 megahertz, which is going to be much more easy to manage in their 500 megahertz of spectrum. So we're not all that different. I mean, we really, really do match up. I threw this chart in here. I made this one, but I couldn't find one that had the PSCs on it. And just kind of laid this out so you can see where all the 160s are and figure out what breaks if you don't have standard power, you do. So that's there for your reference. Let's talk about what we need to design for. Carpeted office space is really the target here in my mind. And for us, that's a significant portion of Cisco's business. Carpeted office space or a model similar to that runs at about 80% of Cisco's business, somewhere in the upper numbers. And if you take a look at that, we did some studies and we looked at proper spacing. Now I know, and we did this because I hear people all the time say, we're down to 500 square foot cells. Well, this is RF. I mean, you can put it as close as you want to, but if it hears itself on another AP, you've got a performance issue because they're going to interfere. So we looked at a model, and in fact, I did a YouTube video on that, of 1,200 to about 2,000 square foot per cell, 111 to about 185 square meters. And if you look at that, that's a fairly dense office. If you look at that, you're talking to somewhere between 40 and 50 feet between APs. And if you look at that, you're talking about 20 to 25 foot radiuses, given a 20% overlap. you've got 20 to 30 feet is what your range is really going to be around that AP. I got 20 to 25 here. In that range, we've got a lot of configurations because we do a lot of parsing online. So we've got a database of anonymized configurations. We kind of went through that, and we weren't able to separate industry or different segments of the market. But knowing that, a lot of ours is in carpeted office space, we went back and looked, and we came up with a number that about 70% of it, 70 to 75% of it, was all operating at 5 gigahertz in that power level 3 to 4 range, which is about 11 to 15 dBm to the antenna. That's before the gain stages or the antenna gains added. So we're really talking about 5 gigahertz at power levels 3 or 4 with 5 gigahertz. And the question is, if I put a located AP, 5 and 6 gigahertz co-located, up on the ceiling, can I do that and replace my 5 gigahertz AP today? Well, we decided to test this. Propagation for 6 gigahertz as it compares to 5 gigahertz. We did this across 12 different test points right in this building, actually outside of this room, where we've got office spaces, we've got cube walls that are tall. So we've got a fairly good representation of what you normally find in a modern office. And we did this, we compared 5 and 6 gigahertz measurements directly from client devices and a mix of those, laptops and smartphones. The second thing we did across the street over in our proof and, I guess we got a whole range over there. We can make anything happen in RF we want over there, which is a good thing. But we did some range rate testing at those rates as well. First off, in the comparison for propagation, I set up one AP, and we did this at power level 3, which is 15 dBm plus 5 for the gain, and we're looking at 20 dBm on channel 36, 40 megahertz. We did the same thing, 6 gigahertz, power level 1, which is 17 dBm with 6 dB gain, and gives me 21. So I'm at, 23, sorry. So we're at a 3 dB delta between 6 and 5, and that's coincidentally about what the path loss is if you look at the bottom of 5 to the very bottom of 6, and we were on channel 5 at 80 megahertz. So I think it's a fairly good comparison, and because these were all individual devices, we just wheeled that cart you see in the upper left-hand corner around to all the test points you see here. We did it inside of cubes, we did it inside of closed offices, that got a door and a window in them. So we tested across the entire range. We tested out the 70 feet away from the AP, and that's significant because I had to walk past 2 APs to get 70 feet out. So this really kind of stretched it and looked at the deltas. What we saw, if I averaged all of that together and accounted for that 3 dB, was really, really even response between 5 and 6 gigahertz. I was actually pretty surprised by that. So I know when you say average, everybody wants to know what's in the numbers. This slides in here. You guys are free and welcome to this deck so you can see all the test results. I called out the clients, and of course, much like clients always do, you've got a bad measurement from one place or another place, and it gets better in another. So all of the details are right there for you. Range versus rate. That's the other thing, because there was a question about whether or not that really translated to usable signal. So we did this again at enterprise densities. We looked at using the same power levels we did in the propagation testing, and then we thought, no, let's cut it back one. So we went to power level 4 and power level 2, respectively 17 and 20 dBm. We maintained that 3 dB separation. We use the same channels, 36 and 5, again, 40 megahertz and 80 megahertz. And then we gathered data on those at 5, 10, 20, 25, and 30-foot distances from the AP. All of the devices are 2 spatial streams. We did this so that we could see the response across the range of the cell. And of course, the individual devices, they come in different. But in general, we had in 6 gigahertz between 900 and down to about 600 megabits per second out at that 30-foot distance. And I've never, I guess I haven't seen it, but I don't think I get anybody complaining about 600 megabits per second. But we looked at the throughput drop across that entire range from the best to the worst. We saw about a 20% delta. And in 5 gigahertz at 40 megahertz, we saw 270 to 435 megabits per second, which is about a 13% delta across the range. And some of the 5 gigahertz radios actually had better sensitivity than the 6. But then we came back and we said, look, that client's got that 6 dB delta. Now, keep in mind that the client in FCC has to stay below or 6 dB below the peak legal power for that AP, not the current serving power, but the peak power. So dropping this down, and I theorized for a long time that really shouldn't matter because we know very well that the client is generally not as sensitive or in a position to see the RF as well as the AP is. But we went back and tested this, and what you see, and I know this is small, but that's 5 gig on the right and 6 gig on the left for each of these clients. And we tested the uplink, downlink using TCP throughput at 6 and 5 gigahertz and was pleasantly surprised to see that it is almost uniform across the entire range. So that 6 dB or the client power really isn't impacting us there. And this, again, keep in mind, is at the densities we'd expect in enterprise. So then where are we on 5 and 6 gigahertz assessments? Can we do a co-resident 6 gigahertz radio and provide similar or same coverage in a cell as the 5 gigahertz radio was supplying when we pulled off the ceiling? The answer is yes. Hang on, I've got the fast-talking legal dude coming. And it says, can one-for-one replacement then of a Wi-Fi 6 and 5 AP with Wi-Fi 6E APs be achieved? And the answer is yes, and here comes the fast-talking legal dude, assuming, and there's a lot of assumptions there. Those are important assumptions to keep in mind. If you do that, I don't think it's as bad as we think it is. And when you start to get into areas that are variable, yes, you certainly are going to want to take some tools out there, get some measurements, and make sure that the assumptions you're making are going to bring you the good news you hope it is. One last note, I want to touch on how we're handling RRM and 6 gigahertz. You may notice, and you will notice, that you are not going to get a question of dynamic bandwidth selection is going to be automatic. You can limit it. But the reason for that is because we think it's important. You're going to get biased towards 80 megahertz in FCC, and you're going to be biased towards 40 megahertz in an ETSI where you've only got 500 megahertz of bandwidth. Good. We got a lot to cover still. AI enhanced RRM. Unless you've been under a rock, Cisco released AI enhanced RRM, and it gives us the ability to analyze all of our telemetry into Cisco's AI cloud. And what that means now is instead of 10 minutes of data, I'm looking at 14 days or more of data, and I'm able to look at trends. I'm able to look at your busy hours. I'm able to look at doing adaptive parameter optimization during different periods of time under differing load conditions. Actionable insights, context per site. Actionable insights, and I'm going to show you some of the ones we got at Cisco Live here, are improving. I mean, the amount of data that I've got, that's what I'm doing full time, is looking at data and saying, well, then we know this or then we know that. So the actionable insights are going to continue to get more intelligent, more helpful, and we do think that it is going to give an increase in operational efficiency to most organizations. And you know as well as I do, the person genuinely that's doing the RF tuning, those are small numbers of people. But this actually gives context to people who aren't that level of expert. What do you need? You need the Cisco RM architecture, which includes DNA server in the center to provide the uplink for the telemetry and the downlink for the command functions over the C9800 controller. You also need the Cisco AI Analytics Cloud. Now, I mentioned we ran this at Cisco Live, and if you ever want an indication of what dog food Cisco's eating, you see what we're running on a show at Cisco Live or someplace where we've got, 12, 15,000 of our closest friends underneath of our network that we're trying to sell. And you will find that we are extremely conservative there. Yet I was able to run AIRM. What you're seeing on the right-hand side is the map of that venue, which was one long contiguous hall. And we took over the green area with about 200 APs. And at peak, we had almost 3,300 clients underneath of that. Right here, it's unloaded. You see the RF performance summary, which is sensitive to load, sitting at 99%. We got our initial convergence in the first 3 hours, which was 6 cycles of RRM, and that's after taking over a reset system. What's significant in this picture is that we did the initial convergence, and you can see all the activity. And by the way, if you click on that, you should go back and look at some of this coverage. You get reasons for every one of those changes. And then afterwards, it got in the stable state. And during peak hours, you'll notice where that first red circle is. We did some power changes because those are relatively unobtrusive. But we also, in between and in the off hours, after 6 p.m., we did some channel changes. So we actually used that busy hour to put the changes and those channel changes out on the 12th, put those changes out of business hours or out of the time where we might impact a client, which is pretty cool. And that's the entire point to this system. One of the insights we got back said that we could be doing more bandwidth, right? And everybody nixed that right away. They were like, nah, no way, man, because we're in high density here. We only do 20 megahertz. And if you take a look at it, it's a low density network. It was because they're using the stadium antennas and they're only using one of the 5 gigahertz radios on that stadium antenna. We're not doing dual 5 gigahertz. The venue was built to do dual 5 gigahertz. So we easily could have gone to 40 megahertz. And later, when you take a look at these sites, you're seeing some of the displays that we get on the AIRM dashboard. And you can actually go down and take a look at the neighbors. So if you don't believe it, you can take a look at the neighbor responses down at the bottom of it. So I just thought it was cool that we got that insight, and by golly, it was right. Cisco CleanAir Pro. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. CleanAir is how I got to Cisco. I got bought with Cognio, who originally developed a spectrum analysis capability that later became CleanAir. And it was a thrilling ride, by the way, because we had a lot of interference in those days. And then CleanAir evolved. We evolved into the RF ASIC, which was still Sage-based, which was proprietary silicon that we did. But it was purpose-built for 2.4 and 5 gigahertz, and we had a lot of interference sources that literally you just can't find anymore. And we were looking at CleanAir or CleanAir Pro. Do we need a new scanning radio? And that's about the time 6 gigahertz dropped and added 1,200 megahertz of spectrum. So we looked at both options. We looked at modifying the RF ASIC, but the losses were starting to stand down or, get high on that, especially with up converters and down converters. And then we looked at doing a different scanning radio altogether, and that is where CleanAir Pro came out. Now, because I came from CleanAir, I'm pretty persnickety about what you can call it. And it had several missions: detect and classify non-Wi-Fi interference. We meet that. Set severity metric per interference. Otherwise, how do you know which one's your problem? Establish air quality for all the AP, all the interfaces on the AP. If you've got more than one interfere, you've got severity for each one, but what's that as a cumulative hit? And then merge same type interference. If you got 5 or 6 APs here in this interference source, you get 5 or 6 alerts. But what if I can take a look at those and establish which ones are really the same interferers? And that's what CleanAir has always been able to do. And it gives us amazing things like being able to first correlate the alarms, but it also lets us draw location because I know the RSSI to each one of those APs. And where our innovation really comes in is how we manipulate that signal and how we isolate that signal in the middle of Wi-Fi. And this is something we've always been able to do and we can still do. And that lets us drive some very, very, very stringent RF metrics. And that lets us do a lot. So up to 64 total interferes per AP right now. We document adds, merge, drop interferes. Merging, when we see more than one device, you're going to get the full details on it. We know where every AP that detected it was, and we know where the closest one is. So it's all in a merge report. And this has been enabled up already on 6 gigahertz ICAP spectrum. So that leaves me with 0.8 DFS, which everybody's had pain with DFS in the past. I don't know how many of you have actually entered into a realm where somebody bought a client that was causing false DFS, but it can be very, very painful. And as a result, I still run into customers today in the US that are of the opinion that they just don't use DFS channels, and we just don't have enough channels, especially without DFS. I always, when I run into one of those customers, look back and I say, well, you know what? They wouldn't be running Wi-Fi and anything more than about 4 channels if they didn't have DFS. So it's been around a while, it's been working, but we still have the same problems. Under DFS rules, we have to scan a channel in that range of 52 to 144 for 60 seconds. It could be as much as 600 seconds in some regulatories. And we need to do that before we can use it. Well, that sets up a problem. If I detect radar, I've got to leave that channel. And if the only channel I can go to, or the one I want to go to, is a DFS channel, then I've got to scan and wait 60 seconds to as much as 600 before I can send a beacon to the clients that I all just told that I was going here. With 08 DFS, I don't have to do that. We're going to do pre-scans. We're going to do rolling CAC. I'm going to tell you all about it. Now, before I go too far into that, this right now is supported on the 9130 only, and it's for -B, FCC, and -E regulatories. This is extremely regulatory dependent. Otherwise, we'd have started doing this back when we put the WISM module on the 9136. You do have to be running iOS XE 17.9 or later to get this. But what does 08 DFS do for us? It does exactly what it says. And it goes out and it builds a list of channels and it puts them in my inclusion list so that if I need to use a DFS channel because of a radar hit or because of an issue, I can jump right to that channel and start broadcasting right away. It does it 2 different ways, 2 different regulatories. We've got Etsy, and Etsy changed their rules slowly. It was over 2 passes that we finally got down and got a very clear rule that said, look, once my AP that can detect the radar, once that has scanned a channel and decided that it cacked it and it's clear, we can keep it that way until that AP reboots or we detect a radar on that channel from that AP. That sets up the pre-CAC. That lets me go through and scan every one of those DFS channels from the time that AP turns on and keep those in an available list that I can switch to immediately if I need to at any point in time, unless that AP reboots or I detect a radar. And if I do that, that's no problem. I'll go back and pre-CAC again. In the FCC, I can only keep 1 channel. I have to constantly monitor that channel in order to use it. So we've got something called a rolling CAC, and this is in the FCC. And it's going to perform a continuous CAC on what I call my reserve or future channel, which is the one I'm going to jump to if I need to. So this sets up a couple of interesting scenarios. First off, if it's dual 5 gigahertz, that's a different story. But if it's not, I just find a channel assignment that matches. Now, it's not just random when I pick a DFS channel. If I do a DCA and result in that channel being the best, there's always a second best. And we also do a mini DCA before we jump to that. So we've got a pretty good idea of what at the time is a good channel for us to use as an alternate. And then we're going to validate that again real quick as we make a decision to switch to it. So there's a lot of logic in there already. If it's dual 5 gigahertz, I want to pick a future channel that matches the bandwidth and is good for both interfaces. If I can't match both interfaces, then I'm going to solve for one. And if I solve for one, it's going to be the busiest, the one with the most clients. In Etsy, not a problem on any of this because more than 2 reserved channels is perfectly possible. But what happens on a Cisco AP when I take a radar hit? Well, let's say I'm operating 40 megahertz on channel 52 and 56, 52 being my primary, 56 being my secondary. And I take a radar hit on 56. Well, I've just broke half that. My 40 megahertz is no longer valid, but I could drop to 20 megahertz, which I do with Flex DFS without interrupting a single client. And then I can make a decision on what to do about that and where I need to move to get 40 megahertz back later. I can use DCA, the alternate channel in DCA. If it's not a DFS channel, I'm going to switch to that immediately because that is the best channel for that AP's position to be on. If I'm going to use the reserve channel, well, then my mini DCA has already gone through that and decided that that is a good channel. It's been pre-capped. I've got the reserve channel. I can switch to that and start operating probably before the clients can get there. Else, If none of those options are available to me to recover from a DFS channel, I'm going to go ahead and pick a channel and just sit and CAC on it. So this is a couple of show commands. DFS channel inclusion list, you can see has 108 and 112. This is FCC, so there is no pre-CAC. Down at the bottom, it has been completed for the CAC. Reserve channels listed. And then if you take a look at the Etsy one on the right-hand side, you can see all of the channels available to you in the DFS channel inclusion list, and pre-CAC is complete on this.
Question, the mini DCA, could you just comment on the time frame that takes place?
Extremely quick, because what it's doing is it's actually taking a look at the last neighbor messages and just checking the metrics on that to make sure that the channel that it came up with the last time is still valid.
And so are we talking like hundreds of milliseconds, or is this seconds, or?
It's milliseconds.
Okay.
It's milliseconds. It's happening in the background. And that, by the way, that's been in the code for a long time. That came, Flex DFS is always on, whether you have DBS changed or not. It's been a lot done around DFS channels.